Good evening and welcome to the Visiting Scholars Program series for Spring 2022. As part of this series, the Honors College at Purdue University brings to campus an interdisciplinary group of scholars to respond to complex issues of our time. Our theme for this semester is A Post Pandemic World Reflecting and Preparing for the Future. To get the series started this semester, we are excited to welcome Dr. William Spriggs, who is professor in and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University and also serves as chief economist to the AFL-CIO. In his role with the AFL-CIO, he chairs the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, and serves on the board of the National Bureau of Economic Research. From 2009 to 2012, Dr. Spriggs served as Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy at the Department of Labor, having been appointed by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the US Senate. Dr. Spriggs's previous experience and leadership includes roles in numerous governmental and academic institutions and focuses on issues of economic policy, and opportunity as well as equity. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Spriggs.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the honor of being here with you. I want to be able to talk to you about one of the big topics that's consuming economists at the moment, and give a context for why a lot of us are concerned uh, that there are a lot of nuances in the labor market that unfortunately economists ignore. So I'm going to talk about the COVID labor market. So we'll go to the next slide. And we'll remember the initial labor shock. It all seems like eons ago because we're so tired of everything that we've been going through. But just to give you a picture of how the labor market had been looking over the long run, and the downturn in unemployment from the expansion after the Great Recession, the longest continued decline in unemployment on record, longest continued growth in jobs, and then suddenly this shock that takes the unemployment rate above anything else that's on the chart. And that's what shocked the labor market. Next slide. And then next slide. And then this was broadly felt. All industries in April of 2020 lost jobs. This graph shows the jobs. The bigger the bubble, the bigger the job sector. The higher up on the graph, as you go up the graph, the more the wages in that sector. And then when you move to the left, that means more jobs were lost. And so you see the orange bubble on the far southwest corner of the graph. These are the lowest wage workers. And you see within 1 month, we lost close to 8 million jobs in leisure and hospitality. The majority of those workers were restaurant workers. And then education and health services, which is just a little bit below that dash line. The dash line is telling you the average wage for the private sector, and that kind of mauve colored large circles, education and health services, second for loss, and the blue circle that's further down with some of the lowest wages, lowest only to leisure and hospitality, is retail trade. You will notice the size of the more solid colored green bubble that's very close to the average wage. That's manufacturing. So we want to put this in context to the size of this shock. That orange bubble for leisure and hospitality is about the same size as the manufacturing bubble. We had almost the same number of workers in each of those sectors. And you can see then how important leisure and hospitality was. It's equal importance to manufacturing, but we lost 7 million jobs in leisure and hospitality because of everyone trying to avoid and create a system where we could avoid the disease and stop its spread. But you notice that the far right hand side of the graph, that's zero. That would mean industries that didn't experience any job change at all. And you see that was utilities. All of the other sectors are to the left of the zero. So this was a shock to the entire system, far more extreme for people in leisure and hospitality, but very seismic for everyone. Next slide. So this caused the unemployment rates to spike if you compare January to April. Um, and surprisingly, they spiked the most for white females in terms of the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate for black males and black females didn't spike that much, spiked very heavily for Hispanic males. A lot of people didn't understand this. The black unemployment rate was higher anyway, and so a lot of people were concerned about what was happening to the black community because this spike sent the black unemployment rate to the highest of any of the groups. But in terms of the size of the shock, it wasn't the worst for the black community. Next slide. Now, historically, you could almost set your watch kind of thing to it. The unemployment rate of black men to white men averages around 2.2 to 1. And as you can see, all the way back to 1972. So for about 50 years, it's moved within a very narrow band, sometimes getting worse, like during the downturn of the 1980s. Um, but sometimes improving when the labor market has a shock to it, like the downturn in the early 1990s. But this time, remember that the spike was much bigger for white men relative to black men. The ratio collapsed. This was an opportunity for economists to finally get to understand what really drives that 2 to 1 ratio. Because remember what I showed you, this shocked every segment. It was a total shock to the system. No one was anticipating this happening. COVID is totally outside of the forces of the economy at this point, and all of a sudden, people lose jobs, and the black to white unemployment ratio collapses. The black to white ratio goes 1.3 to 1. A lot of times, economists have tried to explain this 2 to 1 permanency on differences in skills, differences in sectors that people are in. Now we get to test. Is that 2 to 1 some sort of equilibrium in the way that the market itself works and clears the labor market? Or is this really something that is sectoral? If it's sectoral, then black workers should do far better than anybody else because this shock didn't hurt them as much. They were hurt less relative to other groups. And so if this gap, this 2 to 1 gap is really about sectors or education, then this should have been a chance for the black unemployment rate to be much closer for the recovery. Next slide. In terms of employment to population ratios, though, things look a little different. Almost everyone had the same drop in the share of the population that was employed except Hispanic men, who saw a huge hit when it came to the percent change in the adult employment to population ratio, collapse of over 56%. Tremendous loss in employment. And you can see that for black men, black women, and white women, this is about the same, a little worse than for white men, much deeper for Hispanic women than for blacks or whites. Next slide. Now, the loss of job wasn't the only thing that happened. A lot of people, if they held on to their jobs, faced reduced hours. And here we can see that for Black workers, if you actually looked at the totality of that initial shock, yes, Black workers didn't do as poorly as some others when it came to retaining jobs, but did much worse when it came to retaining hours worked. And there, even though Hispanic workers seem to have lost more when you looked at job loss, when it came to experiencing lower labor income, Black workers were much closer to Hispanic workers when it came to that. Whites and Asian Americans had also lost hours. And so this lets you know that this was, again, a shock across the board. It affected every household. Next slide. Now, the first reaction of the government was to try and put in place an unemployment insurance system that could meet the size of the catastrophe. It's very important to remember that I showed you the biggest job loss, single job loss, almost 8 million jobs were in restaurant. In a normal economy, fewer than 10% of restaurant workers who lose a job qualify for unemployment insurance. In the state of Indiana, if you are a full year regular restaurant worker, you do not qualify for unemployment insurance because of the way the unemployment insurance system is created. It has an earnings test to determine whether you are quote unquote committed to the labor force. And so most workers who are restaurant workers do not qualify for regular state unemployment. Congress had to step in and create an unemployment insurance system. This was very difficult for most states to do. And many of the states, even up in May 30th, there were still 5 states in the former Confederate states that had not implemented the pandemic unemployment assistance benefits. So there were a lot of workers that were being left out. Ironically, for Black workers, this had a disparate impact on Black workers' access to unemployment insurance. Next slide. Next slide. Thanks. So this shows you gaps in application and receipt of unemployment insurance. Um, the red is showing did not receive nor did they apply. And that's a pretty big chunk for Black and Hispanic workers. There are a large number of white workers and then a large number of non-Hispanic or non-Black workers who also did not apply. And a lot of downturns, a lot of workers don't apply for unemployment insurance. They know they wouldn't qualify. And so in many of the states that were slow in implementing, there was a delay in those who applied. The kind of yellowish box that's on the left, that's people who received unemployment insurance. And you can see that Black workers were the least likely to actually receive unemployment insurance in the beginning. And if you looked at it from the perspective of those who applied for it, you see that this gap persists. So this is a pretty severe problem in the beginning that affected Black workers differently than other workers at the beginning of the crises. Next slide. And now you see this for women. And again, women are less likely to apply. They are in the lowest wage sectors. Many people in the low wage sectors don't qualify normally. This discourages them from even trying to apply for benefits. In this case, you see that Hispanic women were doing a little better than what we saw for Hispanic men, but Black women aren't doing better. They are continue to be the least likely to be receiving unemployment benefits. Next slide. The other crisis was a dramatic drop in local government employment, well below what was the case for the Great Recession, which was a tremendous drop in local employment. This continues to be a problem. The local government employment has not recovered from the shock of April. And it's one of the difficulties that state and local governments have had in using the federal money because there are fewer local government employees to help them manage the influx of the new money that has come in place. This is a drag on the current recovery. And in terms of getting everybody back to work, it's a drag because this is a sector that has been very slow to recover. Next slide. And this is often called the she session because it hurt women much more than men. You can see the very huge dramatic drop in women's payroll employment. Women went from being over half the employed workforce to being below that. This hurts Black workers more because the majority of Black workers are women. So part of the crisis here in trying to recover and think about what are we going to do with the labor force during this crisis, the workers who are unemployed typically did not qualify for unemployment insurance. This set of workers were overwhelmingly female compared to previous recessions, and we had a weaker public sector to try and help us respond to the crises. So it's a very unique set of challenges as we think about how do we dig our way out of this crisis. Next slide. Now, the problem is confounded because the big weakness has been getting labor force participation back up. And there have been lots of debates about that. I want to go through a couple of the key points. Each time we had one of these bad downturns this century, economists have argued about whether people were going to return to the labor market at all and whether we should consider this a tight labor market or not. One of those that's very popular in current conversations is, I'll call it the big quit. And in the other, this is no longer relevant, but there was this notion that because of the pandemic unemployment assistance and the need to give extra money to those workers, in part to incentivize them to apply for unemployment insurance. Again, remembering that many of the workers who lost their jobs were not normally in the unemployment insurance system and normally didn't apply because the benefits were low and the work effort to try and get benefits would mean too much. And their liquidity issues were so great that getting the benefits, if they're low, wouldn't mean too much. But I'm going to go through the big quit first because that's the current debate, and then we're going to look at the unemployment benefit debate. So next slide. So despite everybody talking about the big quit, it isn't really uniformly true that everybody is out there quitting. The quit rates that have gone up in certain sectors much more than in other sectors. So it's not uniformly true that everybody is out there quitting. There are lots of quits in state and local government, excluding education and the public sector. But when you look in the private sector, you see that it's this kind of jagged tooth kind of thing. Manufacturing has not had a huge spike in quits, especially non-durable goods. That would mean things like food processing. Those are non-durable manufactured goods. Quit rates are very high in wholesale trade. That would be Amazon. Quit rates are very high in accommodation and food services. They're very high in healthcare and social assistance. One of the things that has been ignored during this crisis has been the rate at which workers have been absent because of COVID. And one of the shocking numbers in 2020, 1 out of 10 nursing aides in 2020 missed time at work because of COVID. This was a tremendous increase in absenteeism due to illness compared to what had taken place in prior years. That's a very big strain on the workforce. And as we all know with the current spike, these are a number of workers who are dealing with the disease, being absent from work because of the disease. In some cases now, because the disease is so prevalent in the healthcare sector, workers being asked to work even though they are ill. And so the quit rate there we kind of understand. Accommodation and food services, wholesales. I want to talk about that with the next slide. And here, even though people say it's quits everywhere, quits are not everywhere. Each of these red dots represents a different state. Our unemployment and insurance system is not uniform at all. As you can see, the horizontal graph is showing you the average weekly benefit you get if you're unemployed. Each red dot representing the average weekly benefit in a different state. And so you can see it ranges from a little below $200 a month up to $500 a week. And so from a little under 200 a week to about 500. So that's well over double, right? Over 100% gap in benefits. Those states that have higher average weekly benefits, as you can see, the dotted line, the black dotted line, gives you the fit to the red dots. This is the trend line that's inside that information. And it's sloping downward, meaning that the higher the average weekly benefit, the lower the quit rate in these states. The quit rate did not go up nearly as much. Higher unemployment benefits allow workers more time to get a job that actually fits them and their skills. Low unemployment benefits mean that workers can run short of cash and need to go get any job. Doesn't mean it's going to be a good fit. And as we can see from before, right, we all know Amazon has been hiring. Well, it's quite easy in a high turnover sector to get a job, but that doesn't necessarily mean you really want that job. It just means you need to meet cash flow issues. So this isn't really the big quit as much as it is the big retreat from the support of unemployed workers and this problem that we have in not getting all sectors back up and running at full speed. Next slide. Now, there was this big debate about what or how we should interpret giving people $600 supplements to unemployment. In the beginning, we did that because we knew that we were requiring workers in many places to give up their jobs, and we wanted to approximate the average earnings of unemployed workers. $600 compared to the normal unemployment benefit would get you very close to the average weekly paycheck, which is close to $1,000 for most Americans. And you can see when the $600 supplement was there, people were not exiting unemployment that quickly. Um, their rate of exit does seem to go up, but the difference between that blue line and that's kind of aqua colored and the dark blue line is showing you a way to think about what the response rate would have expected to be. You need to consider that there are more jobs being created after August than before August. And you can see that it had an effect. It's definitely the case that the exit rate goes up. But in the final analysis, the difference between those two lines shows you not that much. So as much as we made a big deal about the $600 and the $300, the best estimates are telling us that on the margin, maybe 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 workers got a job that they otherwise would not have gotten if they had got higher benefits because they would have continued holding out looking for another job. That didn't make that much difference. That isn't why we're having this smaller labor force. Next slide. Now, one of the big challenges of this recovery has been, can we get people back? And our firms reacting as they have in the past to kind of up the ante on what qualifications you need for a job. And remember, most of the jobs that were lost were these low wage jobs, not low skill jobs, but low wage jobs. And so the orange dot there is showing you the education requirements showing up in job postings. And you can see that education requirements have dropped overall. If you look within occupation, you get the little blue dot, little blue bar, and you see that employers aren't upping the ante when they're looking for employees. They're actually lowering educational requirements. So you would think that this should help the recovery because before we've had a slow time recovering with workers who had less education, but now you can see this huge bias that a lot of the job postings have shifted the composition of the way education factors into hiring decisions. Companies are in fact posting less educational requirements, not more. Next slide. Now, again, this typical thing of, well, the black unemployment rate um, is being driven by educational differences. Uh, well, that falls apart. This recovery, in fact, employers are looking for less educated workers. This never was a good explanation for the black unemployment rate. And we can see here that while the Hispanic unemployment rate exploded, as we saw at the beginning, the biggest shock was to Hispanic workers. Their unemployment rate has come down tremendously. The Asian American unemployment rate, which also spiked, has come down rather rapidly, and the white unemployment rate also has come down rapidly. We're not back to where we were in February of 2020 for any group. So the notion that, oh, the labor market is tight and we're fully recovered, we still have not recovered from, and many workers would argue nowhere near where we were. But you can see for black workers, this very, very painfully slow return in terms of their unemployment rate, which is remaining much higher than other groups. So even though the black unemployment rate compared to the white unemployment rate collapsed, we're now back to the 2 to 1. And so it doesn't matter. Um, there is something else in which, the way the labor market operates in terms of clearing that creates the 2 to 1. It has nothing to do with the industries, it has nothing to do with educational attainment. In fact, the unemployment rate right now for high school dropouts is 5.2%, which is lower than the unemployment rate for the black community. So, just as I showed you, employers are looking for people with less education. So, that's not an explanation for the high black unemployment rate. And the fact that the unemployment rate has returned almost to normal for less than high school educated workers compared to black workers, again, shows there's something different. This is not a story you can tell with education. Next slide. Which brings me to the key component, the thing we should all be most concerned about, and that's the employment to population ratio, the share of people who actually hold a job. And you can see at the end of the 20th century, you look at that peak labor market, we had around 82% of prime age workers, that's the green line, who held jobs. We were almost on a course to get back to that when you look at what was going on in January and February of 2020, and then suddenly we lost all these jobs. We are on a path back towards getting to that 82%, but we are a long way away from that 82%. And you see the long period of the recovery from the Great Recession So that kind of big dip that you see in the middle of the graph, that's the Great Recession, where you see the share of prime age workers fall from 80% down to 75%. You see how long it took that green line to then get back to that 80% bar. We are recovering much faster than we did from the Great Recession. We've had much greater fiscal stimulus to keep people's incomes up so that we can make that recovery. But we're still a long way from getting back to 82%. Overall, the employment to population ratio, this is all Americans, not just those in the prime working age. We're still a long way from the 65% that we used to have in the labor force. A lot of the recovery in the employment to population ratio has come about because we've done so much to get labor force participation back up, a lot more than in the past. We've done even more to get the unemployment rate down. But the challenge going forward is whether our policymakers will see this as a tight labor market or not. And this gets back to understanding the black to white unemployment gap. If the black to white unemployment gap simply reflected skills, then it wouldn't be a big deal. But because it doesn't, it shows us that there are some employers who are still being picky and choosy about who they would hire. And that means if they're being picky and choosy, despite a lot of whining that they're giving that they can't find workers, it means that, well, no, it must not be that tight. And this inability of economists to confront the mechanisms by which there are frictions in the labor market that's making it harder for us to reconnect workers to jobs. That inability to understand those frictions is very important for understanding what should the Fed be doing. Are we now in an inflation spike? Are we going to see wages, and are we going to see a repeat of the 1980s? Whether economists adjust their understanding or not will depend on the kind of policy solutions that we have. And that's why it's important to understand at a granular level what is happening in the labor force and be far more sensitive to racial disparities. So we can stop showing the slides, and Ushma, if you want to go ahead, you can look for some questions.
In concerned about more broadly in terms of what's going on in the world around us. As we are waiting for some questions to come in, I know some of my students had been reading up some of your work on both racial disparities in the labor markets and workforce, as well as in unemployment insurance, for example, as well as what your some of your work in gender disparities. Excuse me. And so some of the things that I think my students were curious about was, in terms of these kinds of disparities more broadly that we see in the workforce. Um, what are the kinds of differences you see between now, this sudden recession that we had in 2020, and we sort of, as your graphs have shown, we've seen a rapid recovery from that very rapid decline, versus the Great Recession that we had about 10, 12 years earlier, in 2008. And so, what are the factors that sort of allowed for us to have that kind of a rapid recovery this time around versus the previous time, and how has that impacted um, sort of minority groups, gender participation in the labor workforce, and so on?
Yeah, so this time, surprisingly, we got a far better immediate response from the government when you
Hmm.
look at the downturn. A more
Hmm.
traditional approach was taken after the Great Recession. So in 2009, we extended tax cuts that the previous president, George Bush, had put in place. And we deepened our commitment to those who are low income workers by expanding uh, food stamps, the SNAP program, and providing assistance in that way. We made some adjustments to the earned income tax credit, but we didn't put a lot of money in the hands of the households. This downturn, both with the CARES Act that was passed in early 2020, immediately upon the onset of the virus disturbing the economy, and then in addition, what we got this year, which was the American Rescue Plan. Both of these help the balance sheets of households. So, for the first time during a downturn, we quickly saw that low income households were able to keep consumption up. This was very important because a lot of business takes place within communities, and because of residential segregation, not just by race, but also by income. In a lot of downturns, low income workers lose their jobs, and as a result, the money that flows in their communities dries up, and that hurts the businesses where they live, which hurts employment where they live. This time, we kept consumption up in low income communities. This helped support the services in low income neighborhoods. And remember, the services that low income neighborhoods get are different. If you're in a low income neighborhood, then you are more likely to do like a dry cleaners or a beauty parlor or or restaurants for fast food. High income neighborhoods is where you would see gyms and spas and nail salons. Well, those jobs disappeared and didn't come back in those areas where you get sit down full service restaurants and high income customers. So in low income neighborhoods, workers in those neighborhoods were able to keep their jobs longer. Made a big difference in this recovery. And so we didn't lose as many jobs as you might have predicted from the tremendous drop in income. And as I mentioned, we put in place unemployment insurance that covered a lot of workers who normally did not get unemployment insurance. So in the Great Recession, restaurant workers who lost jobs just lost jobs. They didn't get unemployment benefits. This time they did. That's a big difference, and it made a big difference in the lives of people. And of course, the the stimulus checks that we gave that covered people for whom none of these categories fit. Right? There are some people we couldn't reach through unemployment insurance, and that became a challenge. And then a key element this year was to advance the earned income tax credit to low income workers. Low income workers have not qualified because most of the low income workforce gets the earned income tax credit and they weren't eligible for the child tax credit. So ironically, we felt that, oh, you already get something because you get the earned income tax credit. But by extending the child tax credit, making it fully refundable, and by giving it to families monthly instead of making them have to wait until April on one lump sum, we were able to protect their consumption. And this was a time of high uncertainty for workers, whether they would have a job. A lot of the unemployment was recycling. Sometimes people would go back to work and then their restaurant would close and they had to be on unemployment again. And this amount of money that we gave to households protected their consumption, and that made the difference. So, for once, we had an economic downturn and the poverty rate went down.
That is really a good point, I think. Thank you so much. We are getting some really good questions from students. One question is, where do you predict that these kinds of trends will go moving forward in the next 5, 10, 20 years in terms of the labor markets?
The biggest challenge we have is that we collapsed the care economy. And unfortunately, the legislation to revive the care economy and get it on the footing it needs to be has died in the Senate. People keep calling it social spending, and this is
Mm-hmm.
a real irritant to me. This is not social spending, it is infrastructure. We
Mm-hmm.
allowed that care economy to decline for most of this century. The prices for care was well out of reach of the median worker. And so that was a drag on women's labor force participation. In order for us to
Mm-hmm.
get back to 82% of prime age people having a job, we're going to have to solve the problem of women's labor force participation. We didn't fully recover women's labor force participation from the Great Recession because we didn't solve the care economy problem. And now this crisis has collapsed that whole economy. And and so we need the government to recognize this as a necessary infrastructure. If we can get that in place, then we can have a full recovery and we can return to the growth path we were on back in 1999 before the Great Recession. But we're going to have a very hard time returning to anything like the growth path before the Great Recession. I'm talking about before 2008, not
Mm-hmm.
2020 and COVID. Getting back to
Mm-hmm.
2008, getting back to now well over 12 years ago, because we we don't have this infrastructure. And it, whenever there's a chicken or an egg, you cannot count on the market to solve the problem, because we would need each individual company on their own to say, I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to have paid sick days. I'm going to have maternity leave. I'm going to have all the things so that the care economy can function. And even then, it would still be a challenge because it would have to be affordable so that most women could have access to that care economy. And that can't happen without the government stepping in. The market itself, if it returned, would only price the care economy out of reach of most women. So
Mm-hmm.
that is going to be the biggest challenge the United States faces, because we're not being able to get the political understanding that without that, our economy is going to just flounder.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So I think connected to that a little bit is another question from a student who asks, um, what is it that young people can do to try and make sure that we address some of these issues more broadly at the policy level? And then, how is it that we can try and bring about some of the kinds of changes that are needed?
I hope they take from this lesson that the market is not some god. There are so many people who worship the market as if it were God, meaning that it's a beneficent thing, and that it is omnipotent. The market is neither omnipotent nor beneficent. The market is just the market. It's an auction, and the clearing price can be painful, as what we're going through now, with shocks to various points and different supply chains, causing prices to spike here and there in unprecedented ways, because we've never had a global thing like this except World War II. And in World War II, we abandoned the market. In World War II, understanding that the market would generate unbearable price spikes that wouldn't be good for anyone, we abandoned the market. We put in place rationing, and we made sure that everything would be affordable at a given price, so we wouldn't get price gouging. We wouldn't get fluctuation in prices. What we are going through is how the market reacts, and it's not comfortable and it's not beneficent. It's very painful depending upon where you are in the market and how it behaves, but it is far from beneficent. And once you understand that and you accept that, well, why should we accept what the market does? Because the market isn't necessarily right, nor is the market a long term thing. It doesn't necessarily price in some longer term horizon. It can inflict very great pain over a short term. John Maynard Keynes, in commenting on the market, famously said, yeah, in the long term, this may all work itself out, but in the long term, we're all dead. So, I mean, solving the problem in the long run does not solve problems. And hopefully people would see that, you know what, we need a care economy. That has to be part of the infrastructure because we can't get everyone to work. This is not the 18th or the 19th century when women are supposed to stay at home, be barefoot and pregnant. That's not a modern world, and we don't live in that world, and we don't want to live in that world. And if we want to live in a modern world with a modern economy, then what's in the infrastructure has to change. In the 19th century, people didn't build roads because they used ports. We got most of the goods to market using waterways and canals and ports. This is the 21st century. You need roads, you need airports, you need railroads. You have to have infrastructure. And just as it would be outdated to say, well, just put it to a port, and if you can't get it to a port, then who cares? Well, if you want to have a modern economy, you have to have childcare.
Absolutely. That is incredibly important. And I can speak to that from personal experience. So, another question from a student is, I was wondering if you think that the wage gap um, that currently exists, and so as a consequence, could that sort of be related to the various kinds of jobs that people are taking now as opposed to what they did before? And then connected to that is this idea of I think referencing one of the students is referencing your work on raising the minimum wage. And so this idea that, will raising the minimum wage have that desired effect more broadly, or will it have some drawbacks as well? I mean, and of course, I think this also connects to a lot of misinformation that's out there related to raising the wage and its all of its pros and cons. And so, if you could shed a little bit of light on that and connecting with the wage gap that we currently are experiencing.
Yeah, so one of the things we are getting to observe because of the way we shocked the labor market is the extent to which the low wage labor market really did depend upon what economists call monopsony power, the power of companies to set the wage. And they were taking advantage of occupational segregation by gender, which is huge,
Hmm.
occupational segregation by race, and residential segregation by race plays a role in isolating workers and making them feel that they didn't have many choices, and the discrimination that was real, that if workers got out of bounds, so to speak, and ventured away from these very closed places, then they would encounter huge amounts of discrimination. It wouldn't be worth the job search. But we blew those markets up. The restaurant industry, in particular, relied on this greatly. Now these employers are out in the real market. They no longer have those captive markets because many of those workers, faced with no income at all, took the risk of going out and seeing, can I find other work? We know that women got more successful at landing construction jobs, the industry that is the most male dominated of any of the industries. And the result was that the share of construction workers who were female went up. And in fact, women recovered their employment levels in construction ahead of men. And this getting out of the comfort zone, being able to venture out, meant that these job networks changed and people realized maybe in this environment where it's very hard for me to get back to my old job, it might pay for me to look for other work. So part of this is we found out how deep these monopsonies were, and the reaction has been that these firms have had to respond to a market driven wage, which is much higher. So wages at the bottom, particularly where this monopsony power was very strong, have risen much more than wages at the top. Median wage workers have not seen very much of a wage increase, on the average of about 6%, versus workers at the bottom who are getting a 14% raise. Some of that because it was already in the books, because many states were already on their path towards a $15 minimum wage. And in fact, over half the American workforce is in a state that's on its way to a minimum wage well above the federal 725, that helps
Hmm.
to boost the wages at the bottom as well. We have studied this inside out, upside down, over and under, and we still do not find the disemployment effects of a higher minimum wage. And as we are finding out, that's because economic theory would predict that if you have monopolies, if you have firms that are using their their power over wages, their power over workers to, in essence, exploit the workers and the disadvantage that the workers have, then what you will get is higher wages actually lead to more employment, not less employment. And so the idea that raising minimum wages is bad for the government to do turns out actually no. If monopsony dominates the market, it's a good thing for the government to do. It pushes firms to something that would be better. There can be a very long-term scarring effect of this downturn because of the collapse in women's labor force participation. Interruption in career paths for women is one of the big contributors to lower wages for women as they work their way through their careers. And then, of course, the gap gets bigger as women get into the prime age because of these gaps in their employment history. We are the only nation that does not have paid maternity leave. And the result is we have more women than in other countries who have these disruptions to their labor force participation. And that is the biggest explanation I can offer for why the pay gap between men and women in the United States is larger than in any other of the other 20 largest economies, the G20, other than India and Turkey. I mean, those are the only two of the top 20 economies where women are at such a disadvantage compared to men. We have to have paid leave uh, to make our workplace more flexible, and so our workplace can be more resilient to shocks to the system and to make it fairer for everyone. We need employers to make that commitment to keep workers even through shocks that may occur. And these shocks are going to continue. They won't be as global necessarily. I mean, we cannot rest assured there won't be another disease that could be of this magnitude. But we do know that we are going to have environmental catastrophes that will interrupt workers' labor force participation, and that's a certainty. It's happening every year now at a much higher frequency. Whether it's the tornado that went through the 5 states and ripped apart some houses but not others, kicked
Hmm.
some workers out of work because we destroyed where they were working, left other people with jobs. These disruptions are going to be so individualized. We need a whole system that allows households to be more resilient. So we need paid leave, we need paid sick days, and we need paid maternity leave in order to address the pay gap that we have between men and women. And like I said, this downturn threatens making that gap be exacerbated and even harder to address because we're not doing the things to let women get back to the labor force.
Absolutely. I think that's an incredibly important point. I think I'd say we are a little over time, but I know that I just see one last question from a student that I think would be good to connect to some of the points you made in your presentation. And so he has asked, would encouraging local government employment reduce the disparate impact of unemployment on African American workers? And would doing so leave them vulnerable in a future crisis? And I think this connects to some of your earlier slides that were talking about local government job losses.
Yeah, so state and local government, the workers in that sector are disproportionately female. The majority of state and local workers are female, and then they are disproportionately black. And that's because it's one sector that does not discriminate as much or anywhere near as much as the private sector does. And again, because the employment process is far more transparent. The qualifications you need and who does the hiring is far less susceptible to someone introducing discrimination. And and that lack of employment is hurting our recovery. State and local governments have been sitting on millions of dollars from the federal government to implement programs to help families that are in need of rental assistance. A lot of those programs haven't been fully implemented. Um, we know we're going through this crisis with our schools and the issue of testing students for the illness, for COVID, keeping the schools open, having bus drivers to get the kids back and forth. All of these things are under crises because we don't have the state and local workforce back that we had
Mhm.
before the crisis started. This is vital because we have to defeat COVID in order to get the economy back to normal. There is no
Mhm.
path to a normal economy without us winning the COVID fight. And there's no path to that without state and local government having the people in place to implement and plan the policies. And
Mhm.
money is part of the solution, but you got to have people to manage the solution.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that is incredibly important, I think. And I think it connects sort of back to your earlier point that we have to have uh, sort of a bigger picture rather than just focusing on the market and just looking at that. There has to be a bigger picture in trying to make sure that we understand just how all of these systems work and trying to make sure that we begin to address some of these disparities that you've outlined in both your research so far as well as in your talk today. So I think with that, we will end our session for today. We had some excellent questions, and I really appreciate your very insightful lecture for today, as well as your responses to the questions that students have posed. So I really appreciate that, and I thank you. And I thank you everyone for joining us in this live lecture series today. And hope everyone has a safe and warm rest of your week. And thank you so much, Dr. Spriggs. And we really appreciate you joining us for the Visiting Scholars Program.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, hopefully one day I get to do it in person.
Absolutely. We would love to have you here sometime. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Okay. Bye bye.